My name is Crystal, and I am the host of Stories from Palestine podcast, and also a licensed tour guide by the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism. Together with my colleague Salim, we are organizing 3 10-day programs this year to discover Palestine. There is still space in the upcoming program mid-March, and also in June and October. We travel around the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Jaffa with small groups, maximum 10 people. We provide historical background, we introduce you to the Palestinian heritage, and we make sure that you get to meet a lot of locals. We stay in family-run hotels, and we also spend 2 nights with Palestinian families. We do some short hikes, easy hikes, and during the October program, you can also join a day of olive harvesting. If you are interested, then check out our website for more information. I will ask Roberto if he can add a link to the show notes of the podcast, but you can also write it down. It is storiesfrompalestine.info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Zachary Foster. Zachary is no longer an academic. He's currently the director of product at academia.edu, which we may say is sort of a para-academic somehow. Nevertheless, he produced a very good amount of academic works, mostly articles. In fact, most of his works have been published by Jerusalem Quarterly and other important Middle Eastern studies journals, mostly discussing Jerusalem and Palestine in the period of World War I, but his PhD thesis is very much about Palestine and the invention of Palestine, which will be a major topic we're going to discuss later. But first of all, Zachary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Zachary, if I look at your sort of resume on LinkedIn, or Academia, in fact, which is the website you're working for, there's something that kind of like got my attention. Before you started your academic path, you in fact worked as a tourist guide in Jerusalem. Can you tell us a little bit more about that period in your life and what entailed to take tourists for, shall we say, alternative tours around Jerusalem?
Thanks for that question, Roberto. And I will confess, first of all, that I was living in Jerusalem in 2007 and 8 and 9. So we're talking, 13, 14, 15 years ago. So this is some number of years ago. So let me just preface everything I'm about to say with the fact that I haven't done this in a long time. But when I first moved to Jerusalem in 2008, I started volunteering with an organization called ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. And I was volunteering with them for a number of months. And this entailed receiving alerts whenever there were home demolitions. And we would rush to the site of the demolition, do our best to prevent the demolition. In reality, that never happened. In reality, what that meant was trying to show solidarity with the families who were the victims of the home demolition. It meant documenting what was happening. It meant spreading the word about what was happening, raising awareness about the cruelty and viciousness with which the Israeli military police destroyed people's homes for having committed the crime of being born Palestinian in Jerusalem. Because as you well know, the municipality of Jerusalem has been hell-bent on pushing out its Palestinian residents since 1967. It started almost immediately after Israel conquered Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank and other parts of Palestine in 1967, and has been on a mission to Judaize Jerusalem, to push out the Palestinian residents of the city. And so the mission of this organization that I was volunteering for was to was to help Palestinians who are being victims of these policies of Judaization and ethnic cleansing. And so that meant helping Palestinians rebuild after their homes had been demolished. It meant showing solidarity and documenting the demolitions themselves. And so, in that capacity, the organization also led tours in East Jerusalem, going around parts of the city, Wadi al-Joz, Ras al-Amud, Sheikh Jarrah, Jabal Mukabbar, and many other parts, Isawiya, and many other neighborhoods of the city, and showing people what was happening on the ground, showing people the differences in the allocation of the Jerusalem municipality budget between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, the dramatic differences in the treatment in terms of the number of health clinics in East Jerusalem versus West Jerusalem, in terms of public parks, in terms of public infrastructure, roads, sewage, and basically anything that involved public money being spent in Jerusalem. And so the point of these tours was to really show on the ground, not just this disparity in the funds being allocated to East Jerusalem, but also going to the sites of the home demolitions themselves and talking about why these people homes were demolished, going to the Israeli Jewish settlements inside East Jerusalem and talking about how they get so much public funding, how they get these beautiful public parks and beautiful swimming pools. And so this was really the goal of these tours, was to expose a side of Jerusalem that your average tourist or average pilgrim or average traveler to Jerusalem wouldn't have ordinarily seen if they're just going to the holy sites and seeing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Western Wall and whatever else.
Can I ask you how visitors reacted to what you were showing to them?
I think most of the visitors were shocked. I think maybe shocked but not surprised. Shocked because of how dramatic the disparities are. I mean, just to rattle off a couple of statistics, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with, but perhaps some of the listeners would benefit from. So Jerusalem, something like 35 to 40% of Jerusalem is Palestinian, okay? And since the early 2000s, the official stated position of the Jerusalem municipality was to never let the percentage of the population of Jerusalem exceed 40%. That was a danger zone. And so if you are a Palestinian living in Jerusalem today, you are an existential threat to the Jerusalem municipality, and moreover, your very existence, the fact that you are a living and breathing human being on planet Earth, is endangering the municipality of Jerusalem according to its own self-image and according to its own vision and goals for its own future. And so of the 1,000 public parks for example, just to rattle off a few numbers, 1,000 public parks in West Jerusalem, 45 in East Jerusalem. Okay, so 35 to 40% of the population gets 4% of the parks. West Jerusalem has 36 swimming pools. East Jerusalem has 0. West Jerusalem has 26 libraries. East Jerusalem has 2. 2% of the municipal cultural budget goes to East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem has fewer post offices, fewer health clinics. There was one report in Haaretz where the Haaretz journalist was standing outside of there's an office that helps people claim unemployment benefits. At 4:30 a.m. there is a line outside the office in East Jerusalem. Okay, so this is the life of East Jerusalem. You're being classrooms. Classrooms. By the way, there are not enough classrooms in East Jerusalem. There are literally a shortage of classrooms. Why? Because they can't build. There's no building permits, because when Israel annexed East Jerusalem in 1967, what it did was it encircled all of the built-up areas around in East Jerusalem. Ras Lamud, the old city, Sheikh Jarrah, Isawiya. They basically drew lines around the pre-existing built-up areas and said, you can only build within those areas. All the open areas, all of the unbuilt-on areas, they were declared green zones. They were declared environmental safety zones. They were declared industrial zones. They were slated for Jewish settlement. So basically, Palestinians cannot build. They cannot build anywhere in East Jerusalem. Something like 95+% of building permits are denied building permit applications are denied to Jerusalem's Palestinian residents. So Palestinians are constricted and confined to these already built up areas pre 67. They're also, by the way, not given Israeli citizenship. They have to apply for Israeli citizenship, and they're regularly denied that. It's an extremely long and arduous process. Talk to any Palestinian who's actually tried to obtain citizenship. It's incredibly difficult. Why? Because Israel doesn't want these people to be citizens of the state of Israel. They want them to leave. They want them to leave Jerusalem. Go to the West Bank. Go to Jordan. Go to the United States. Just get out of Jerusalem. You are not welcome there. Your presence is an existential threat to the state of Israel. I can't even remember your question at this point. I'm just ranting, Roberto.
You are ranting a little bit, but I guess visitors, I'm sure they learned a lot when you were taking them around about the condition of East Jerusalemites, and particularly the daunting questions of demolishing houses, sometimes only on just the pretext to be slightly connected to a family of an individual who may or may not be, in fact, a terrorist. So there is all of this question about, the discrimination of demolishing houses. But I want to move to the question of your academic work, because in 2017, so not so long ago, really, you completed your PhD dissertation for Princeton, called The Invention of Palestine. And I'm just quoting here from your page. Palestine exists in our minds, not in nature. If Palestine doesn't exist, why do we identify with it? We identify with Palestine first because it has a name. In fact, we only identify with places we've named.
Thanks for reading off that little bit from the abstract of my dissertation, if I'm not wrong. You're absolutely right. I think that I was fascinated by the name, the word Palestine itself, the name, the idea, the concept. Because if you ask a physicist, or if you ask a biologist, or a topologist, or a hydrologist, or a chemist, there is no such thing as Palestine. You cannot study Palestine as a physical aspect of the natural or chemical or biological world, because it doesn't exist. A physicist cannot tell you what Palestine is. Only a historian and a humanist and a social scientist can tell you what Palestine is, because it's an invention that human beings made up. We just made it up. We just said, hey, look, there's this place and let's call it Palestine. And so the question I have as a historian is, how is it that in 2023, millions of people around the world identify as Palestinian? When did they start to do that? What were the historical processes and developments that led people to say, I am a Palestinian, I identify with Palestine? Not only do I identify with Palestine, but I love Palestine. I print Palestine on my t-shirts. I sing the Palestinian national anthem. I wave the Palestinian flag. And I'm willing to even die fighting in the name of Palestine. How did that happen, Roberto, if this is a completely made-up idea? That is the question that I'm trying to get at in my dissertation. The origins of the idea of this dissertation come from having encountered so much propaganda and so many myths growing up in a Jewish community exposed to Zionist propaganda and Zionist mythology. And as you may be familiar with, if you were exposed to this literature, this mythology, this propaganda, you would believe that there never had been a place called Palestine in history. In fact, it was always part of Syria. In fact, the Palestinians themselves, they actually had always called themselves Syrians or Arabs. They never called themselves Palestinians until Yasser Arafat came around in the 1960s and convinced everyone they were Palestinians. And so that's the narrative that you would have been raised with if you were raised in a Jewish community like the one that I was raised in. And so when I encountered the historians' version of Palestine history and the history of the Palestinians, rather than the mythologists or the propagandists' version of the history of Palestine and the Palestinians, I was in complete shock. I was like, wait, hold on one sec. You're telling me everything I was raised with was nonsense? This is mind-blowing. And as somebody who has an open mind and as someone who's very curious, I wanted to dig deeper. I wanted to find out the truth behind these people calling themselves Palestinians. What was their real history? And it turns out, if you want to study the origins of a Palestinian identity, there's actually a very rigorous, a very empirical way of doing that. You go into the historical record and look for the word Philistini or Philistiniin or Philistine in the historical record. And you can do this in a very systematic, very methodical way, which is exactly what I did for my research. And so I asked myself, okay, let's just leave aside the polemics and try and understand when was this word used in history, starting from the etymological history. Let's just look at the sources and try and make sense of who used this word, when, and why. And that is really the starting point of my dissertation. And so I start in the ancient world and try to understand when this word first came into the historical record, and then how it got from the ancient sources of Egyptian hieroglyphics and Assyrian and ancient Hebrew, how it got from those languages to Latin and Greek, and then how it got from Latin and Greek into Arabic, and then how it got from Arabic to all the modern Eastern and Western languages, and when it was popular in Arabic, and when it became less popular in Arabic, and then when did people start to use the term Palestinian, and Philistiniyin, the plural, the Palestinians. When did those terms start to get used in Arabic? And the answer that I settle on is the late 19th century. And I'm happy to pick up any of those threads because I know, I covered a lot of history in just a very short amount of time. So feel free to, to double click on anything that you want to talk in more greater detail about.
I want to start talking about something that's that is in your thesis. Now, first of all, your thesis was not published as a book, but I remember clearly that it received a lot of attention, and perhaps you can speak about it. But there's one point at the very beginning, which is very much about the question, who cares about Palestine? And I remember you talking about, a pilot, I think it was Air France or Alitalia, one of them, saying welcome to Israel, Palestine, and eventually got fired because there was a campaign against Air France, probably. And that kind of like remind me of the question of, who cares about Palestine really? Is that only Palestinians, or as you said earlier, there's a lot of people outside Palestine that care about Palestine, and why do you think is so?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So you're absolutely right. The first few pages of chapter 1 of my dissertation, if I'm not wrong, are getting at the history of the controversy over this word, right? Because as you point out, there were a number of controversies in the 2000s and the 2010s, and these controversies continue to the present day. There's almost there's a new controversy every month or every 2 or 3 months. It's honestly hard to keep track of them at this point. But the anecdote that you referenced, you had multiple anecdotes like this, by the way, not just one, where you had, I believe, an Air France pilot, an Alitalia pilot, and I believe even another pilot, maybe it was United Airlines, I forget now which airline, basically when they land in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, they say, welcome to Palestine, or welcome to Israel, Palestine, which is the more neutral version of that. And so you have all of these pilots saying, welcome to Palestine or welcome to Israel, Palestine, and a couple of them got fired. Now, let me ask you this question, Roberto. Should you lose your job for saying, welcome to Palestine? By the way, there's a rapper based out of the UK who had a Chance the Rapper, very popular rapper, who has a song where he talks about Palestine throughout the song. And when the BBC was playing that song on the BBC, they bleeped out the word Palestine as if it was a curse word. When Mark Lamont said on CNN, free Palestine from the river to the sea, he got fired. When the Bank of Palestine, based out of Gaza, was trying to reopen after it had been closed by the Israeli military in 1967, and it was slated to reopen, the Israeli military said the only way you can reopen is if you change your name. You're not allowed to use the name Palestine in the name of your bank. Well, let me ask you something about the word Palestine. Is the word Palestine dangerous? Palestine, 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 Palestine. Alert! You have 10 seconds to find shelter to the nearest cover before you get hit in the face by my saliva. Okay, Palestine is not a dangerous word, Roberto, okay? But it's perceived to be a threat to the state of Israel. Why is that? Why does the Israeli military, why does your average Israeli, by the way, why does your average Jewish American feel uncomfortable and feel attacked when they hear the word Palestine? Well, I think the answer is quite simple. And it's because the state of Israel and the Jewish people who support the state of Israel are hell-bent on erasing any trace that there was ever a Palestinian people living in the land of Palestine before the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. And that is ultimately the reason why all of these people and the state of Israel are hell-bent on erasing the word Palestine from memory and from view, is because they just cannot tolerate the fact that there was a people here before they showed up, and that their existence, the name Palestine, the existence of the Palestinian people, is a continual reminder and a continual source of remembering that the project of Zionism was built on top of the ruins of another people. And so that's the reason why the word Palestine is controversial, and why these Alitalia pilots are getting fired when they say, "Welcome to Palestine."
Let me ask you something. If you use the word Eretz Israel, this is another concept that has been in existence for millennia, I guess. And so I was wondering if you see Palestine and Eretz Israel sort of clash with each other, or is there a way these two can actually, I don't want to use the word coexist lightly, but can they overlap with each other?
I'm in, I'm in, I'm an optimist, Roberto. I do believe that for both the safety and security of all Israelis and all Palestinians, I do believe a rapprochement is necessary. I do believe that both peoples, all people between the river and the sea, for various historical reasons that are very complex and impossible to disentangle and undo and unravel, are destined to live together. And there's nothing you or I or any Israeli or any Palestinian can do to change that. It's fait accompli. It's we're 122 years too late to unravel what has happened. We cannot undo the past, but we can look to the future and look to ask ourselves, how can we live in a world where everyone between the river and the sea can lead a prosperous and safe and secure life? And ultimately, I think the way to do that is through rapprochement. It's for Israelis to say, no, this land is not called Israel. There are people here who call it Palestine. And for Palestinians to say the same thing about Israelis, and to say, look, these people, regardless of how they got here, regardless of whether the way in which they got here was justified, or the way in which they came to power was justified, that's all irrelevant at this point. They are here and they're not going anywhere. And the way to, I think, live side by side in peace and security for everyone between the river and the sea is for Israelis to say, look, this place is also called Palestinian. This place is also called Palestine, and for the Palestinians to say the same thing, and that's not because that's just or that's fair or that's right, but that's in my opinion the only way forward. And so, yeah, I wish everyone called it Israel Palestine or Palestine Israel, or maybe we take a page out of Muammar Gaddafi's playbook and call it Israelstein or Pal Israel, or we could come up with all kinds of iterations. And by the way, Roberto, that is my personal opinion, and I respect people who disagree with me, but I do think that is ultimately the only way I see long term that we can have a peaceful and prosperous Israel-Palestine in the Middle East.
And I appreciate the fact that you use the word long term, because if we think about the current political situation in Israel in particular, and obviously this current right-wing government that certainly is based on the motto Palestine never existed and never will, it's very hard to see a near future moving towards that direction, but it feels more it's moving towards a much more conflictual one than a one of rapprochement and reconciliation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I think that I'd rather be effective than right. I think that it's easy to be right and hard to be effective. I think standing from the sidelines, I think being an activist, I think being an advocate, a content creator, a podcaster, it's easy to stand on a high horse and say, this is how the world should be. Guess what? It's much, much, much harder to be in a position of power and be in a position where you can actually change things, because that requires compromise. That requires bringing people together. And in order to make a compromise, in order to bring people together, sides that are opposing in every possible imaginable way, you got to make compromises. And I think one compromise that needs to be made is in the names people use. And that comes from both sides. Both the Israelis and Palestinians do need to compromise on that. And by the way, the Palestinians have already compromised, by the way. They call the place Israel. You know, I think it's time for the Israelis to start to acknowledge, hey, listen, we need to start to call this place Palestine. And by the way, I was involved with the New Israel Fund for a number of years. And I said, New Israel Fund, guess how to make your organization more effective, more inclusive. Guess how to build bridges with the people you absolutely need in Israel, Palestine to build bridges with. And that's the Palestinian community inside Israel. You cannot build a left-wing coalition in Israel without the Palestinians. It's impossible. They're simply too important. You need to bring them in. You need to include them in your coalition, or else you're going to be left with Meretz, which doesn't even make the Israeli, doesn't even literally have enough, doesn't even make the Knesset. You're going to have Avodah, which is dead. And then the Israeli left is going to consist of war criminals who brag about bombing Gaza back to the Stone Age. That is the Israeli left today. Why? Because they refuse to include the Palestinians. And so the New Israel Fund and the Israeli left, if they have any hope of having any influence in Israeli society in the future, they absolutely need to come to terms with the fact that the Palestinian people are not going away and they need to be reconciled with. And that includes recognizing the name Palestine, first and foremost. And by the way, that is just the beginning. That's sort of acknowledging the reality in order to be able to move forward and make progress.
Before we talk about your other academic work, particularly about Palestine during the period of World War I want to engage with you in a very brief duel, I would say, about cultural appropriation. In fact, I realized when I was browsing your PhD thesis that you made reference to a killer bolognese. And I was just curious about who's making this killer ragu, bolognese sauce that deserve to be mentioned in your PhD thesis. And I, here challenging whoever this person may be.
Avevo un'ex morosa italiana por 10 anni per sapere. Adesso sto imparando spagnolo, così il mio spagnolo arriva al mio italiano. Però se vuoi sapere, mia ex morosa italiana. So I can translate that to English for the listeners, or we can just keep it in Italian between me and you.
I guess we can just keep it in Italian and it's perfectly fine. So let me bring to your second part, sort of your academic work, which is related to the period of World War I. You published a couple of very important articles about the famine that hit Palestine during the period of World War I. And I had the chance to talk about it with Salim Tamari and Issam Nassar, but I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more, particularly focusing on your work, what happens and how did Palestinians broadly defined, because obviously we're talking about a period where Palestinians meant to be a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslims, a Druze, or anybody that literally lived in Palestine. And how did they react to this tremendous set of circumstances, the war and famine?
World War I was one of the most consequential periods in the history of Palestine, certainly the modern history of Palestine, perhaps the history of all of Palestine throughout all time periods. Something like a third, maybe a fourth, anyone's guess as to the exact percentage, but something like 20-30% of the population of Palestine was wiped out from starvation, and more so starvation-related diseases like typhus. And it's a very long story, and there's a lot to say about it, but to summarize a tremendous amount of history in a very short period of to summarize this complex history, what happened over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century was Palestine was getting incorporated into the global capitalist world market. What that meant was around Jaffa, you had dozens of business owners building huge orange groves that were dependent on the exports industry to Europe and abroad. And by the way, those orange groves gave rise to thousands and thousands of laborers and new jobs. And then in Jaffa, you have this new port, and Haifa, the port is growing massively to export those oranges abroad. Not just oranges, of course, but in Gaza, you had a huge wheat and barley industry that was booming based on the export of barley to the British beer industry. You had cotton that was being exported from Nablus, and olive oil and soap that was being exported from Nablus. And then you, of course, have the tourism industry, which is booming, which you're the real expert there, not me. But by the eve of World War I, you had tens of thousands, as many as 40 to 50,000 tourists visiting Palestine on the eve of World War I. You had the remittance economy. You had dozens, if not hundreds, of missionary schools opened throughout all of Palestine. Guess what? Those missionaries provided subventions to students and stipends to students to study in those schools. So you have this booming economy based on exports, based on missionary activity, based on tourism and it's booming. And guess what happens on the eve of World War I? That entire economy disappears overnight. The banks close. People can no longer withdraw money from banks. Well, guess what happens when you can't withdraw money from banks? You've been returned to the Stone Age. You're now living in a barter economy. And so in November 1914, the banks shut down. All the foreigners pack up and leave. The Ottomans throw in their lot, tragically, with the Germans. And by early 1915, the Allied powers have blockaded the eastern Mediterranean coast. And so on the eve of the worst economic catastrophe in all of Palestinian history, then come the locusts. And in March 1915, swarms of locusts invade the region. Swarms so big that were described by contemporaries by elders who had lived through many, many locust attacks as the single worst locust attack they had ever witnessed. And so from March 1915 until the following year, a full calendar year, more than 12 months, you had repeated incursions of locusts, such that in the winter of 1915, something like 10 to 15% of the winter crop of wheat and barley was destroyed. And then in the spring and summer of 1915, something like anywhere from 60, and the estimates vary, and it's very hard to get very precise details, but the estimates are somewhere between 60 to 100% of the fruits and the vegetables and the legumes, the chickpeas, and the olives and the olive oil. Remember, the peasant diet was first and foremost based on olives and olive oil. And guess what happened to the olives and the olive groves come November 1915? They were wiped out. And so after the economy was brought to a standstill by the war and by the blockade, then came the locust attack, which wiped out the source of food for the region's inhabitants. On top of all that, you had the army requisitions. You had soldiers going from door to door requisitioning animals, requisitioning food, requisitioning pots and pans. Then you had the loss of labor. The entire male population was conscripted. And then you had the monopolization of the rail traffic. And so if you wanted a rail car, how do you get wheat from the places of its cultivation to the places of its consumption? You couldn't. You had to bribe an Ottoman soldier 10 times what the pre-war cost of that rail car was, from something like 20 lira to something like 200 lira to ship a container of wheat on a railway in Ottoman Syria in 1916. And so as a result of all of these calamities, you had the worst famine in probably the history of Palestine, certainly in the last many hundreds of years, if not ever. And so it was a tragic event that is not really fully grasped, even by specialists, historians of the period, let alone lay people. And so it's basically been forgotten, I would say. The average person, the average Palestinian, the average Israeli just has no idea of the calamity and the catastrophe. And I don't know whether that's because of shame or whether that's some kind of intentional will to forget what happened. But it was a tremendous tragedy that today is mostly forgotten.
It is indeed forgotten. But what was interesting is that Salim Tamari, when he published his book, The Year of the Locust, reminded us that actually people that lived throughout the war remember the war more in terms of the invasion of locusts and famine than effectively for the war itself. So what it transpires that people related to this trauma and not the war itself, because this is what really they experienced on a daily basis. And I was wondering if in your research, perhaps you came up with the material suggesting that potentially an event like this, and a trauma like the invasion of locusts and famine may have strengthened political and social identities to be a Palestinian or even to be a Zionist.
That's a fantastic question. And that history has yet to be written, or perhaps it has been written and I'm not familiar with it, which is entirely possible. But you are absolutely correct to point out that tragedy brings people together. Famine, locust attacks. Guess what? The locusts do not discriminate. between Palestinians and Muslims and Jews and Christians. The locusts do not care what the color of your skin is or what God you pray to. They have a voracious appetite, and they will eat your crops and your olive groves, no matter who you are or what your ethnic or religious or national affiliation is. And so there are many anecdotes, by the way, of Palestinians joining Jews during the war years. Palestinians helping Jews protect their crops. Jews helping Palestinians protect their crops. Jews and Palestinians going out to the fields together to bang, metal against metal to try and scare away the locusts with the sounds, to try and erect sheets of metal in the sands to try and prevent the locusts from crawling towards the settled regions where you had large cultivated areas. So you do have those anecdotes. And in fact, I even published an op-ed in Haaretz a couple of years ago with Siraj Assi, where we talked about some of these anecdotes that we were able to uncover in the literature. So folks are curious, they can look to that op-ed, which is just a 500,000 word piece. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are incidents, and I'm curious to hear, Roberto, what your experiences have been, because you're the real expert here. You tell me, how would you answer that question?
I have the same kind of idea that obviously, traumatic event brings people together, but I'm not entirely sure to what extent then they shaped sort of the future. I mean, they had these moments where obviously, as you said, locusts don't discriminate. They attack every single individual. They don't look at crops and say, well, we're going to attack these ones because they are owned by Jews, or we're going to attack the others because they're owned by local Palestinians. But nevertheless, I start thinking that despite the trauma is shared by all Palestinians, regardless of their religious affiliations, eventually politicizations, unfolding of events kind of let them drop this memory. And, the traumatic experience which brought them together simply dissipated. And I think this is also the reason why people no longer remember that. It's just gone, despite the fact that it had a tremendous impact over Palestine. And again, invasion of locusts are still an occurrence. They do happen. And so, this is not something that was unusual. Certainly what was unusual is that it occurred at the same time of, obviously the unfolding war events, including the fact that the Ottomans were not really providing any sort of a means of relief, during this period of time. So you had the exacerbation of blockades by the Allies, famine, which was already caused by war events, and of course, mobilization of resources, plus the locust. And that made me think that as much as this was traumatic and brought people together, politics, identitarian politics, became more powerful and potent than trauma itself. But this is, again, my view over this particular period of time.
Look, the war was so overshadowed by the political events that accompany it. The Balfour Declaration, obviously, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the promise to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and so the war and the Arab Revolt, obviously. So you have these incredibly important political events that are happening in parallel to these very traumatic social events of the famine and of the requisitions and of disease and of trauma. And so what is remembered is not the trauma; it's the politics. And for better or worse, that seems to be what the war is remembered by.
I see that we're becoming cynical historians here, so I want to move to a couple of questions I have about two cities. So in 2016, you wrote an article about Ramla, and I must admit that after reading your article, I was in Israel back then. I was in Beersheba. I actually visited Ramla for the first time because I obviously knew where Ramla was and is many times, by train. Obviously, you have to go through Ramla, but I never took the time to actually stop. And then all of a sudden, your article hit me, and I realized that Ramla was not just this, I'm going to use the word shanty town because that's what it looks like nowadays, but it had a very important historical past. And in fact, wandering around, you have the Crusader walls and the buildings and obviously Christian churches all around. But you made the point that actually Ramla was more central to Palestine than Jerusalem. And this is a very curious argument.
In part, I made that argument to catalyze the conversation. In part, I made the argument to attract readers to the article. In part, I made the argument to create some buzz, to create a bit of controversy, which I'm not afraid to do. And in fact, which I quite like doing. But look, ultimately, I was trying to catalyze a conversation, which is to say that for the first 400 years of Islamic rule and Arab rule in Palestine, it is my view that, I mean, by the way, I don't even think this is controversial. I think this would be accepted by almost any historian of Palestine for those first 400 years. But it's very clear to me, at least, that the center, the geographical, the economic, and political center of Palestine was not Jerusalem, it was Ramla. And by the way, I mean, I'm just stating facts at this point. I'll get to the controversy in a minute. But Ramla was, in fact, the political capital of Jund Philistine, which was a district in the early Umayyad Caliphate for hundreds of years. And so as a result of it being, by the way, it was the seat of the Caliphate for a number of decades. So not only was it the political capital of Palestine, but it was actually the seat of the Caliphate of the most important and largest empire in the entire world at the time. Okay, so Ramla was very important politically. And then as a result of its political importance, it also attracted merchants. It lied geographically on the main road connecting Damascus to Cairo. If you read the sources, the geographical treatises, people like Ibn Ahmed al-Maqdisi or al-Muqaddisi, the famous 10th century geographer, he describes Ramla as an incredibly fertile region, olive groves, all kinds of crops being grown in the region, wheat, barley, vegetables, all the legumes, right? So an incredibly fertile region with a hinterland, connecting Damascus to Cairo. By the way, also connecting Jerusalem to Jaffa. So it sits right in the middle of those kind of really the geographical center of Palestine. And so as a result of its importance in the early Islamic period, it gets associated with the word Palestine. So what you have is over the course of the really throughout all of Islamic history, you have many dozen. I want to say probably between 1 to 2 dozen sources, maybe as many as 3 dozen sources, conflating the city of Ramle with the word Palestine. So they'll say, Medinat Philistine, yani Ramle. They'll say like the city of Palestine, in other words, Ramle. And you have dozens of those sources, not just Muslim sources. You even have a Jewish source. You have Christian sources. And then on top of that, you have Christians as well as Jews, as well as Muslims who are from Ramle and are using the term Palestine as a matter of course. In the 15th century, so for example, you have a tombstone from inside a mosque in the 15th century in Ramle that says, Palestine. Now, find me another tombstone anywhere in the entire region of Palestine from the 15th century that has the word Philistine on the tombstone. Only Ramle will you find that in the 15th century. Now, go to the 16th century and 17th century. You have Khair ad-Din al-Ramle. Khairuddin al-Ramli, one of the most important muftis in the entire Ottoman period. He is using the word Palestine as a matter of course. You have Najm ad-Din, his son, who writes he writes a biographical dictionary in the 17th century. We're talking 1670s, I believe, where he's using the term Palestine as a matter of course. So not only do you have Palestine, Ramle, it being the capital of Palestine, the geographical, economic, and political center of Palestine for 400 years, not only do you have dozens of people conflating the words Ramle and Palestine, in addition to that, you have many people from Ramle using the term Palestine to refer to not the city of Ramle, but a broader region. Basically the region of Palestine that you and I and many other people know today. And so for all of these reasons, I think there's a very interesting history, and mostly, by the way, forgotten history that I think almost no one was really aware of. Literally almost nobody. I mean, by the way, I was unaware of it too, and I'm writing a dissertation about the word Palestine. It took me, the person who's supposed to be the expert on this topic, digging through many different centuries of sources, digging through many different languages of sources, European languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Ottoman Turkish, in many different types of sources, Sharia court records, travel logs, history books, chronicles, Geniza records. Okay, so you have across many languages, many sources, many time periods, multiple and fascinating associations between Ramla and Palestine that have been mostly forgotten today.
Let me take you to Gaza now. So you recently acquired, as you say, more than 600 documents on the history of Gaza, covering from the 1910s to the 1960s. Is the beginning of a new project, or you're just collecting material?
For many years now, it has occurred to me that uh, there is a dearth of materials to study the history of Palestine and the Palestinians, especially if you are Palestinian. I mean, that's the great irony of it all. If you're from Gaza, if you're from the West Bank, guess what? You don't have access to the research, to the sources of your own people's history. And by the way, that's not a coincidence. That is intentional. That is a direct result of the military the military occupation in the case of the West Bank, and is a direct result of the siege in the case of Gaza. And so, to my mind, this is just incredibly frustrating. You have a collection of 60,000 records that lie in the Israeli National Archives, sitting in the Hebrew National Library in Givat Ram, in Israel. These are the quote unquote abandoned books. Okay, 60,000 of these records that were taken from the homes of Palestinians. They were taken from the homes in 1948, and they were collected, and they were cataloged, and they were made available to Israelis and to internationals, but not Palestinians. And that was honestly totally enraging to me. And especially as a person who was benefiting from those documents, whose research was fundamentally dependent on that corpus of materials that was made available to me. Why me? Because I was privileged, because I had access. And so I felt this need, I felt this urge to do something. And so I started uploading maps that I had collected over the years, maps of Palestine and maps of the Middle East that were rare, that were hard to find, that I had scanned for my own research purposes, but wanted to make available to everyone, especially Palestinians who were denied it. And I've recently been expanding that collection. And so have just been going around looking for documents, to be totally honest with you, looking for maps, looking for manuscripts, trying to find stuff that I can share with the world, and especially share with the Palestinian people who have been denied access owing to their status as Palestinians, as occupied and oppressed peoples. And so I had an opportunity to visit Gaza and managed to, by the way, it's not free to buy those documents. So I was able to, God bless, I was able to buy many hundreds of documents from the only antique dealer in Gaza. And I've digitized them all, and I've made them available to whoever wants to study the history of Gaza. And so you have many hundreds and hundreds of documents in those collections. These are personal letters. They're private documents. They were owned by many different families of Gaza. They, over the course of the past however many decades, Salim El-Rais, the antique dealer, who is, by the way, one of the friendliest, nicest, sweetest people you'll ever meet in the entire world. And he has this incredible antique store with some of the most incredible books and documents and pamphlets from, oh my God, I can't even tell you. God, if I was a rich man and money was not a thing, and I had duffels of suitcases that I could have taken out with me, which I was not able to, I would have bought 10 times as much as I bought. But yeah, just incredible stuff there. I mean, letters. A Palestinian writing a letter in 1925 from, one member of a family to another about personal matters related to, divorce and love and marriage, just incredibly personal stuff that honestly you'll never those are one of one documents. You just can't find that stuff anywhere else. Lots of merchant records. The private papers of merchants. So if you're interested in economic history of Gaza, this is a very, very rich source. If you're interested in the social history, like I was saying, marriage and divorce, personal matters, this is a very, very interesting collection. Political issues, obviously. How can you talk about the history of? There's a lot of stuff from 1948, by the way. during the war years. So if you're a historian of the 1948 war, you're going to find a lot of very, very interesting documents, why people left, what led to the cause of fighting in Gaza. So there's all kinds of fascinating documents that, again, I haven't actually had a chance to really in detail go through them, but I would encourage anybody to have a look at that stuff. And it's all available on my website, PalestineNexus.com. You can go check them out, and I would encourage and welcome anyone who wants to download them, research them, share them. You're very welcome and very invited to do that.
This was Zachary Foster, a scholar of Palestine and also director of product at academia.edu. Thank you so much for this engaging conversation. I will definitely post in the notes of the show your website so that people and listeners can actually access the material and also get a different story coming out of Gaza and not the usual one as portrayed by the media.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.